Greetings and welcome to another video. One of the many aspects of futurism that we follow on this channel is the evolution of space exploration into an industry and to its own economy. Space exploration as done by governments is something of the past. Now there is a large commercial dimension to space. And as we see from the CNBC article over here, the space economy grew at the fastest rate in years to 469 billion in 2021. 469 billion is a lot. That's almost 0.5% of the entire world economy. Now, if you read the article, notice that they include things like GPS and satellite communications and things like that in the total for the space industry, but that's fine. Now, if you thought you weren't spending any money on the space sector, then anything you use in terms of your cell phone, your GPS, etc., is in fact part of that. So you are already spending some money on space-related products. But as we see over here, the global space economy grew last year at the fastest annual rate since 2014, hitting a record of 469 billion, according to a report by the Space Foundation released Wednesday. Total output by the world's governments and corporations in the realm of rockets, satellites, and more expanded by 9% year over year, the report says. Now this ties to another theme that I've spoken about in earlier videos, about how this is the real space age. The 2020s is the dawn of a real space age. Unlike the 1960s and 70s, which is what seemed like the space age before, and we're going to switch over to a video segment that has been recorded long ago where I discuss why the 2020s is a new space age. So we go over to that video clip. One of the final articles I wrote on the Futurist website, assuming I don't write any new articles there, was one devoted to how the real space age is now, the 2020s. We are now entering what is a real space age because of technological megatrends that have enabled a whole host of new private sector activities in space, as well as a new dimension of space exploration that was just not possible decades ago. Now, this is not a statement that a lot of people would consider to be self-evident, because if you're an American, there is a substantial belief that the real space age was in the late 1960s and early 1970s, because that was when we had the Apollo program and the United States put a man on the moon, and to date is the only country that has put human beings on the moon. This has a lot of emotional attachment to people in America, particularly the baby boomer generation who were young at the time. So it was a defining moment in their generation and their culture. And it was a huge achievement, to be sure. However, it was not a huge contributor to where space exploration and space-related activity is today, believe it or not. And here's why. The Apollo program was extremely expensive. It cost 1% of US GDP per year for the first 8 years of the Apollo program. So from the start all the way up to the first man on the moon. 1% of US GDP for 8 years. The same amount of money today would be $210 billion a year for 8 years. Secondly, the Apollo program employed a huge number of people. 400,000 people were employed in the Apollo program at its peak, and that would be like 700,000 being employed today as a proportion of the workforce. That is a gigantic amount of resources put into this endeavor. And yes, the United States won the space race and put a person on the moon before the Soviet Union managed to do so, and therefore the political victory is very obvious. However, that was a short-term victory because the United States also stopped sending people to the moon after 1972, and frankly, virtually no geopolitical event from 1980 onwards was possibly affected by the fact that the United States had put men on the moon between 1969 and 1972. Whatever unfolded after 1980 or so happened all the same, whether there was ever an Apollo program or not. That is simply a fact. It did nothing to move the trend line of even space exploration, let alone other associated activities of geopolitical significance between the two competing powers at the time. But now, technological trends are bringing forth something far more sophisticated. As we see from the article I have over here, we click on this image, making it full size. This chart only begins in 1980, which tells you when there actually were technological trends of importance for space exploration that were worth measuring. It was not in the 1960s. And the vertical axis is the cost per kilogram of putting something into orbit. So as you can see, in 1980, the cost was about $100,000 per kilogram, and those were the early space shuttle programs. By 1995, the space shuttle was somewhat cheaper, maybe $30,000 per kilogram. And later on, you had Falcon rockets and so forth. And as of 2020, we have the Falcon Heavy rocket, which is only $1,000 per kilogram. So that is a cost reduction of 100x over the last 40 years. Now even private enterprises can launch certain things into space. In addition, this trend is not stopping. There are projections for what type of rockets will be available in the future, and this trend is expected to continue until it is very inexpensive to launch things into space. And because of this, now we have a private sector in space. Everything from SpaceX launching Starlink satellites, which will give 1 gigabit per second internet access to many disenfranchised parts of the world, transforming the global economy, to 3D printing in space, where instead of launching finished objects into space, one can merely launch a 3D printer into space and keep filling the printer with filament, meaning printing material, which is much cheaper than launching finished products into space. And therefore you can have huge superstructures in space that can exist in zero gravity but would not exist under Earth gravity. And even things like asteroid mining, where we have already identified which asteroids have huge amounts of precious metals like gold and platinum, and once there is any chance of even accessing the metals in those asteroids, the price of those metals on Earth will plummet, as is an atom trend. If you've been watching this channel, the long-term price of all commodities goes down, even commodities such as gold, because technology can increase their supply faster than demand can grow, especially in the high-tech age of the 21st century. That may not have been true before the 21st century, but the long-term trend of all commodities, including gold, silver, platinum, everything, is down as per the first principles of technology. And a whole host of other applications. Satellites that can give you high-resolution images of the Earth that are useful for climate, agricultural, oceanic information and research. The list goes on and on. So we are now entering a real space age in the 2020s. There will never be a period where it seems like space activity has died down, such as was the case after the Apollo program, where it seems that space exploration had kind of stopped almost. That is never going to happen again. Now each decade will be more impressive than the last, because now we are truly in an irreversible exponential trend of space exploration. And that's because there are actually two exponentials here. Not just this first one that I'm showing you, which is a decline in price per launch, but just the mega trend of Moore's law and other technologies associated with electronics. All those big probes that we are familiar with from the 1970s, like the Voyager spacecraft and so forth, they all weighed about 1,000 kilograms, 1 ton, and they were launched in space when it was expensive per kilogram to launch something to space. But now, as we know, because of the miniaturization of electronics, any 1-ton electronics device from the 1970s has now shrunk by a factor of 1,000,000 in terms of both cost as well as size and power consumption. Therefore, those 1-ton Voyager spacecraft would be a single chip the size of a fingernail today, and also very inexpensive. And since it's so cheap to launch something per kilogram and the weight has gone down, you have two exponentials enabling the launching of electronics into space, and therefore it is many millions of times more cost effective to launch these types of exploratory probes into space. In fact, we could launch thousands of them in multiple directions. Government space agencies like NASA don't have the vision to shrink their electronics down. That's why every probe they launch is the same size and weight as the ones from the 1970s, which is absurd because the Voyager spacecraft is simple enough that any hobbyist could make one today, and if the cost of launch is so low, even private individuals could create their own. We, as a species, should be launching thousands of such exploratory probes in all directions, and the camera resolutions are so much better, and all these images are easily uploadable to the internet, which was also not the case in the 1970s when Voyager was sending back images. You had to check out books from the library to see all the nice pictures of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune that were being sent back to Earth by Voyagers 1 and 2. Now, this is a very complicated topic, and I'm going to have a series of videos on this channel exploring all the new aspects of the private space sector. This is, as I said, the first decade in which we're actually going to have a significant portion of the economy associated with space-related activity, and that will only continue to rise as we go into the 2030s and 2040s. So this is really a very exciting time for space enthusiasts for so many different reasons, and space is even an investable thing, another theme of this channel. In the Apollo era, you could not invest in the prospect of space exploration. There was no way to do that. You had one government in the world putting people on the moon, maybe two other governments doing anything significant in space. It was completely public sector. You couldn't invest in the potential of anything space related, but now you can. And all of these topics are very fascinating, and we will explore them in detail. Now, if you like this type of content, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel, and thank you very much for watching.